All right. So we are going to tackle part two of the civil rights movement. And I don't know if I said this in the beginning of the last one, but I'm just really highlighting just a few things that happened during this movement. There's so many things. And actually, you probably read a little bit more in your notes from the book. And of course, if you've looked through the book, there are way more things with integrating schools and other events that happen. And all of these kind of happen um, sort of simultaneously. So it's not just like, oh, this happens. It's not like a vacuum, right? So it's not like this happens and then this happens a year later. A lot of the stuff's all kind of happening at the same time. So we're going to continue with where we left off with Martin Luther King Jr. In Birmingham, arrested for protesting. And while he was in jail, he writes what is called a letter from a Birmingham jail. It's not really like the title that he gives it, but it's a title that historians give it. And it's actually a really important founding or primary source or document. Actually, in my AP government class, this is one of the documents that they have to know inside and out, because in the document he explains why he and other activists why were they doing this? Like, what was the whole point of potentially being killed, which is unfortunately what happens to MLK in 1968. But the idea behind putting yourself out there and fighting for something that you believe in, and why they were tired of waiting for something. Why are we waiting around, waiting for the government to change it when we have the power to try to change it ourselves? And so the letter, after he writes it, is actually published in newspapers across the US. And so that was really important to speeding up some of the things that will come out of the positive successes that will come out of the civil rights movement, because people could understand, oh, okay, now I get it. Like, now I understand why are they, because, some people, even though they might not agree with segregation, some people don't like they don't like conflict, right? So they're asking well, why are these people out there doing this? Like, look at, they're going to get themselves hurt. They're going to get themselves killed. They're going to get themselves arrested. So they kind of bring it on themselves. But understanding the philosophy behind it and why nonviolence and the use of nonviolence, like I mentioned before, it shows the problem. Here, these peaceful people, all they want is equality and equal opportunity, and yet this is the reaction that they're getting. So it actually moved many more white people, and especially people that were moderate, to support the civil rights movement, and this pushes the movement further along. Also, the disturbing images that come out of the South. This is not like today where you can get on the internet and you can see, people aren't wearing police cams and people don't have phones with them all the time. So to see some of these images was really shocking to many people. And to see the police dogs and the fire hoses and the stuff that's being used on these nonviolent protesters was beyond disturbing. And it was very shocking for a lot of people. And as more of information comes out of why they were doing this, the images that were coming out, it moves other people to start being active, whether it's just writing letters to the White House or getting involved in the civil rights movement in and of itself. And it takes everybody. This is not just a problem. It's not just a Black problem, or it's not just a problem, for a specific group. It's everybody's problem. This is American society. It affects everybody. And so it also takes everybody to try to change the law and try to change what's going on. So these are some of the pictures. This is stuff right out of Birmingham. This is, like I said, the fire hoses that are being sprayed at people who were protesting, the attack dogs that the police had with them. So the political response, is sort of happening too at the same time. So there is a civil rights bill that was being looked at in Congress, and this is in 1963. And so MLK and the SCLC, now MLK is now like a household name, right? Because he's been in the news. It's been going on for a few years. People know who he is. And they organize a march. This is I shouldn't say the first, but this is probably the first big one, called the March on Washington. There were over 200,000 people that will march in Washington, D.C., wanting freedom and jobs and equal opportunity. This is where Martin Luther King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which I know you've heard parts of and may have seen film of that. This was not just like, hey, we're going to go like march because this is, what we're feeling and what we want. This was a very strategic move by the side of the activists, because they know that that bill is in Congress, it's in committees, it is, at the point where it's going to be voted on. So let's show our representatives how many people support it, how many people are out there supporting, this bill. And I can't say that it was 100%, the march that does it, but it definitely had an impact. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, probably the biggest success out of legally and speaking, the biggest success coming out of the civil rights movement is this act. It was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the president at the time, and it basically fulfills the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection under the law. Part of it, the 14th Amendment actually has 3 different parts. But there's a lot of parts and pieces in here, and it doesn't just have to deal with race. Okay, so women, it also helps you a little bit as well, although we do need to have our own separate laws, unfortunately, that passed in the 1970s later. But this is a big, big step. Okay, it's a big step. It doesn't end the fight. It's a big step, though, towards at least ensuring equal opportunity. So let's look at like jobs. So some of you work part-time. When you filled out your job application, or when you go to fill out a job application, you'll see somewhere on the form, or if you're doing it online, it'll say EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. This is or Equal Employment Opportunity Employer, something like that. This is actually like a regulator, a group of people that oversee and enforce this law, and ensuring that people, that you're going to get a fair shot, and that you can't be fired because you're Black, or you can't be not hired because you are Jewish or whatever, because it doesn't just have to do with race, but it's also religion, gender, and national origin. Does not stop the fight, because one of the biggest issues for Blacks after the end of segregation was voting rights, right? Because remember, part of Jim Crow was also suppressing, at the time of Jim Crow, because we didn't have women voting yet, but it was Black men in a lot of ways could not vote, even though legally they can. But remember all of those things like poll taxes and grandfather clauses and all that stupid stuff that people had tried to use to prevent Black men from voting. Even though some of that had been shot down at that point, there were still ways to have voter suppression. So there was another march that takes place in Selma in 1965. So the march was, the activists were marching from Selma to Montgomery, and it's like a series of marches. Some of this was like televised, and it's actually known as Bloody Sunday because of the violence that ensues. So you see the pictures up there at the top. So you've got, the group of marchers, and then the top right-hand corner, you've got law enforcement, beating up some of these people, including, I think in that picture, you can't really see his face, but John Lewis, who is one of, a very prominent civil rights activist, who is now a House of Representative. He's in Congress. He's now, I think, probably in his early 80s, still living. And I think he's in like the front row too of that picture. Maybe. I'm just trying to look. Okay. But anyways, he was one of the ones that was beat up pretty severely during that march. But anyways, he and others who were part of the SCLC were down there to march, but then to also register Black voters. So they want to get as many voters as possible and to raise awareness about Black voting, to say that this is still a problem, that sure, there are things that have like laws that have passed at that point, like the 24th Amendment had already been passed, which eliminates poll tax. But there are still ways to disenfranchise, means stop people from voting, disenfranchise or suppress people, Black people, from voting. So that needs a whole separate piece of legislation, which is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So that this will fuel this whole series of marches and stuff, will fuel this Voting Rights Act. So basically, this helps to alleviate some of the other things that still happen, like literacy tests. Federal government oversees voting registration and elections in states that had discriminatory policies against minorities, because basically, in these states, you can't allow like the state government to run it, even though that's like election law is state law, because they weren't enforcing it, right? And they weren't like doing anything to help solve the problem. So they wanted the federal government to stop it. This has been renewed 4 times. And it renewed in 2006 for 25 years. So it's one of these bills that can come up in front of Congress again, and it's always been renewed. I talked about the 24th Amendment. The historical significance of the Voting Rights Act specifically is that you'll see skyrocketing numbers of African Americans in the South that participate just in politics in general, but also voting and also running for office. So we'll start to see more and more African Americans that will run for office, and whether that's local or city government, state government, and federal government. So let's look at the legacy of the movement. You looked at in the beginning of your notes when you were doing stuff out of the book, the differences between de jure and de facto. So the legacy of the movement is that it eliminates de jure segregation, okay, because that's like the law. And it knocks down those barriers for African Americans to vote and to participate in the political process. So what does that mean? Because I've said like the civil rights movement kind of starts after the Civil War. This is sort of like the climax or the height of the movement, because there's so much that gets done. But does that mean that it's like, okay, well, these laws passed, so now there's like no racism in the US, and there's no like obstacles or challenges for minorities? Well, the answer to that is no. So is the actual like civil rights movement from the 50s and 60s over? Yes, like that part of it is, but it's not in reality in terms of like other people and other types of movements and activism and pressuring the law. That is not done, because de facto segregation in some ways still exists. You may also know or have heard of institutional discrimination, or what we call systematic discrimination. So it's really interesting if you ever get a chance to study this more and more in depth. And part of what you're going to be doing in your civil rights activist presentation or Google slide presentation is to do a little bit more digging in this and to give some more current examples, because this is still very, very relevant. I mean, we just saw this last week with the murdering of a young Black man who was running in his neighborhood in Georgia. And the fact that, the 2 guys that apparently were the ones that did it, and this is on like a video, that they weren't arrested right away. So that's a great example of systematic discrimination. So it's the patterns of these behaviors, policies, or practices that can be part of an organization. It can be part of like living situations. It's actually, if you study sociology and you go into looking at of different groups of people, it's a really interesting and it kind of helps you understand, like, why is there like a Black Lives Matter movement? Why is there these issues between African Americans and law enforcement? Because if you're a white person, you probably don't really like see it, or you don't really realize like what an issue some of these things are, and um, until you really look more in depth and you actually see some of these things that are still part of our reality, even in 2020. Um, one of the really interesting, and this kind of goes along with it, understanding of systematic discrimination. Um, it can even evolve, or see the light of day in things like the coronavirus. You look at how specifically the African American and Latino populations of the U.S. have been hit harder with the coronavirus. I mean, look what's happening or has happened in Detroit in the past 2 months with, that being a hot spot. Like, why is that? Why is that happening? And it kind of all links back to this, because it's not just one or the other. Okay. It's economic, it's social. It's a much more complicated. I mean, I could probably teach a whole year-long class on systematic discrimination. So it's not just like one thing. Okay. So it doesn't mean that, like, as an individual person, as like myself as a white person, doesn't mean that I'm racist. Okay. It's not talking about individual racism as such as like what was happening then. And by the way, I'm not a racist, but it means that it is the what's happening within our society. And a lot of this has to do with the deep rooted history of racism and segregation and slavery and all kinds of stuff that have happened since the creation of our country. And yes, it has gotten a lot better, and there has been great movement throughout the time periods that we've are studying, but there are still issues, like I said, that occur even today. So it's a really, like I said, complicated but interesting topic that I encourage you to look more into, and to really educate yourself, no matter who or what you are and where you are in your life, because I like the saying that sometimes I mention once in a while, but just because it's not happening to you doesn't mean it's not happening. And so I think that, whoever you are, you have to be aware and knowledgeable of those that are disenfranchised, and those that do face obstacles and issues that you might not be, concerned with, but because it's not happening to you, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening. All right. So I'm leaving you with this last picture. This happened in 2015, so it's been about 5 years. This was the 50th anniversary of the march from Selma to Montgomery, and it was really cool. They had this on television. I think it was on a Sunday, because I remember watching the whole thing. But they had asked those that were actually in the real, I shouldn't say the real because this is real, but the very first march, to join President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama. And they had, I don't think they're in this picture. Somewhere is like Bill and Hillary Clinton. You've got George and Laura Bush over there to the right. So you had like past presidents. In between the Obamas is John Lewis, who I just talked about earlier. And there's like, these little older people in wheelchairs that were a part of that first march. And they didn't do the entire march, but they did some of like the pictures that you see in history books, and sort of recreating that. They also had John Lewis spoke, and some other speakers. President Obama spoke. And you think about like how far, the nation has come in race relations and civil rights and equality, but yet, so much work still is there. So it was a really cool like celebration, and really honoring that part of our history, because it's not just like one group's history, it's our history as a nation. All right, so that kind of wraps up just some of the highlights from the civil rights movement. And, again, I wish that we could spend a lot more time on all of these things that we're learning here at the end of our weird school year. But I hope that kind of sheds some light on some of the things maybe you didn't know about the civil rights movement. And in your research about the activists that you're going to choose, hopefully you'll learn a little bit more too. So as always, if you have any questions, let me know, and I will see you later.